So it's been a very interesting experience for me, because I realized again, I mean, I had sort of thought about it last year as well, but I realized again that, I mean, one, this is a really unique project, and I'm very impressed with the students here, and obviously the organization has been really, really wonderful. However, there is this what I see as a tension between the project that I think the Institute has developed for itself, and the plans and the goals, and the kinds of academic research into Sufism that I do and that some of my students do. And so for me, it's been a sort of set of really interesting observations about where we meet for really interesting conversations and where it's just really different. And I know that one of the purposes of the symposium was precisely to talk about methodology, which is why I decided to do that in the keynote speech I gave. I wanted to sort of reflect on what I think I've been doing, but also point out that those are obviously not the limits of what can be done. And there were particular presentations, I thought, from some of the students here at the Institute that offer sort of glimpses into where the bridge is, where the connection might be. And then there are other presentations that are that I think are a very different project from what academics in Europe and America might be doing with and about Sufism. And so I would be really interested in continuing that as a conversation. So I see this as an opening, both for those of us who came from somewhere else, who were invited to be here, but also as an opening for the faculty and the students here at the Institute to think about what they're doing. And my intention with the keynote speech was to extend an invitation to think more explicitly perhaps about what it is that the students at the Institute here are doing and why they're doing it. Because this question of purpose, or like, why are you interested in this question? What is your question? What do you hope to gain from these studies that you are engaging in? And I'm like, I would also be interested in questions like, why did you pick this topic? This is something I ask my students all the time. So I want to know what brought you to that. And of course, you know, like in this particular case, sometimes it's a kind of inspiration that's perhaps difficult to describe. I get the sense that there are topics that are certainly approved of because of the nature of the Institute. But this question of why am I doing this? Why am I interested in this? What am I trying to do here? I think could be more clearly out in the open. And on a very practical level, I think students need to learn how to present well. Some did a really great job, and some are the kinds of presentations where I would take my own students to the side afterwards and say, you know what, this is something we have to work on. There is a difference between writing a paper and presenting your ideas. You can't read a paper that is supposed to be read like sort of with the text in front of the reader and expect that to work the same way. So one of the things that I often tell my students is you have to write a presentation. It's not the same as writing a paper. And so some were really engaging, and some were the kind of paper that everyone in the academy dreads at conferences, where you sit and you're like, these sentences are so long and I can't even follow them all the way to the end. So I think on all levels, I mean, I see it sort of as a set of exercises as well, and as an opportunity to think about how that comes together and how it reflects the project that the Institute is.
Our Institute has special emphasis on methodology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You told a little bit about this as a contribution for,
Mm-hmm.
of this symposium.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add some more on it?
Sure. So I have been thinking about this a lot because I do think that it's becoming more clear to me that there are differences between I sort of want to be careful with that word, but the secular study of religion and Islam within the study of religion and Sufism within the study of Islam and religion. There's also a very particular history to that, both in Europe and in North America. And some of the purposes of the Institute, I think, are different. What I would like to see is a more explicit reflection on what's different. So I can see projects that do something that scholars in the West, quote unquote, have done for a long time, which is to read texts mostly to figure out what the authors meant by them. So there is a particular way to read a text that is about understanding what the writer, the scholar, the author was trying to tell us with that, or was trying to tell his contemporaries most often. But there's another way of reading text that I think is important for the Institute, which is to read these texts for what they can mean to us. So in a sort of, in an inspirational way, so to speak, right? So where it's not so much about what the author wanted. He usually, sorry, most of them are he's. So they were writing for their own day. Most scholars, medieval scholars, and even 20th century scholars weren't writing for the future. But they left these texts for us in some ways, and they survived. And so there are things that I think we can do with these texts that are not about what they meant necessarily, but what this can do for us, what these texts can help us do. And especially with Sufism, and with Sufism not as an intellectual exercise, but as an actual path, I think these can play a very important role the way some of the Sufi teachers in person did in history and do today as well, right? So some of us have access to living teachers, but we also look to these texts to tell us something about what we're supposed to do. And I think these two purposes, reading for understanding of the past and reading for the present, are not the same project. And sometimes I think people mix these with each other, which is the point where things become very confusing. And the other part of purpose for me is, and that's something I had said on Friday as well, that for me the academy is about conversation. We can all have really great ideas in our own studies or wherever we're having ideas. We could even write them down, but the moment we write them down or the moment we give a talk about them, we're interested in dialogue. There's no point in writing something down for yourself unless it's in your diary. And so this dialogical quality of the academy also requires finding out about what other people have thought and said. And so that's another piece about methodology that I think is important and interesting, which is that on many of the topics that were discussed here, there is an existing conversation. And yet the students took a specific text. Ibn Arabi seems to be a favorite, which is very interesting, I think, because he's sort of the most intellectual of Sufi writers, perhaps. But they only took the text. They didn't look at what's already been written about Ibn Arabi. Now, sometimes the secondary literature can be a distraction, but I think it's always worth knowing about it and then saying, this is not what I do. But that's different from just taking the text and pretending there is no secondary literature. And so in terms of methodology, and I can see why some of this is an issue, because this brings us to the question of language again, right? So like, what languages do the students have access to? What is translated already into Turkish? What can they read? I'm assuming that Karl Ernst's work, I know that Karl Ernst's work has been translated into Turkish. I know that Anna-Marie Schimmel's is available in Turkish, but there might be other scholars that are not. So that sort of limits perhaps the possibilities. But for me, methodology in part would be looking at that existing academic literature and deciding what students and faculty at the Institute want to be in conversation with, rather than not looking at it at all because it's somehow a different conversation. So it's a matter of doing the kind of deep research that's necessary to do one's own, because ultimately we all want to be in a place where we do original research, where we have original ideas. But for me, the exchange, the dialogical quality is what makes this worth my time, both in terms of exchanging ideas with people and in terms of teaching. And for me, exchanging ideas with people and teaching aren't very different from each other. So I've never treated my students as somehow people who don't know anything. I will tell you, sometimes my undergraduate students who don't know very much about what I teach have really profound insights that I can't have anymore. And so I see all of this academic endeavor, both teaching and scholarship, as inherently invested in exchange and invested in that dialogue.
Very important. You talk about the reading
Mm-hmm.
the texts,
Mm-hmm.
the archives of
Mm-hmm.
everything. So the language would be not the Turkish,
Mm-hmm.
Arabic, or
Mm-hmm.
other languages that we know, but the way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say about this?
Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I understand the language
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be the,
Mm-hmm.
the language that we know,
Yeah.
Turkish, whatever. And it was very interesting to hear that we need to read the texts and archives,
Mm-hmm.
archives of everything. You said music.
Yeah, music, body.
Yeah.
So to expand what we think of as language, as expression. So what other ways other than what we sort of technically think of as language, what other things do we have available to us that can be incorporated in that? So do we express ideas through our bodies? Do we express ideas through music? Do we express ideas through art and architecture? And I'm sure there are other forms that I'm just not thinking about right now, but that is part of the archive that we have. I got the feeling after the keynote, someone came to me and said that texts are very important. And my response was, yes, texts are very important. I didn't say they're not, and I also didn't say we shouldn't read them. I said there are things in addition to that we can do that I think also help us read the actual texts that we think of differently.
I'm going to think about it.
Mm.
So one more question would be about the progress that we take as the institution and the foundation. We were in Japan last year, we were together, and you are following our work. What would you like to say about these things, if you call it progress?
So I see development. I see that there is a lot of energy and effort that goes into thinking about these questions. I think it's extremely important because the institute here at Üsküdar University is a teaching institute. Its main purpose is to train students at this point. That the students get included in this. I think my feeling is at this point that the students have really benefited from these interactions that they've had here, from having to publicly present their work in this way, being live streamed on TV, including downstairs. So I mean, these are all opportunities that are part of training students. So I'm very happy that that was the next project after the conference in Kyoto that was not student-oriented, but that was bringing together established scholars. And so this is an important piece that I think I'm suspicious about progress for other reasons, like this idea of progress. But I think you're building something, right? Like there's a sort of building of things that happens. And institution building is hard and is complicated, especially when there is no existing model necessarily, because clearly the project of the Institute is something that has no model. You're not looking to an existing institution somewhere necessarily. So there's something really new about this. And I think one of the things that I haven't seen come up explicitly that I find really important because of the perspective, the sort of vantage point that I'm looking from, is to point out that one of the really important contributions is to focus on Turkish Sufism, on Turkey as a space, as a geographical space with a long and important history, and to recognize that that aspect of Sufism is understudied because, well, the main reason is that a lot of scholars in Islamic studies don't learn Turkish, and so don't have access to either Ottoman or later Turkish sources. And there's such a richness to that story and to these histories that I would even say, look, Ibn Arabi is being studied in all kinds of places, in all kinds of languages. Rumi is being studied in all kinds of places, in all kinds of languages, but there is something to this story, especially of Ottoman Sufism, that's not being studied quite as much. And I would hope that the fact that the students here obviously know Turkish, that it's easier for them relatively to learn Ottoman Turkish, to learn how to read Ottoman Turkish, that those are all possibilities that are unique to this institution that can't quite be carried out anywhere else. And then to bring that to the world, right? Like bring that to other parts of the academy as its contribution.
I want to ask you a question about works on Islamophobia.
My work?
Recent
works.
Mm-hmm. How can we collect the fruits of this small symposium, but it's important at the same time to the solution of big problems?
So, I mean, we need to study Islamophobia more because there is more of it. It's increasing rapidly, both in Europe and in America. This is a part of my work that I don't like doing at all. It's the most, well, it's one of the most difficult aspects of my work, but it's also something that is really important politically, and because I think academics have a responsibility to do that kind of work. So, you know, like we need it more than ever, and we need support for it, which is sometimes coming from our institutions and sometimes it's not. I wonder, I talked about this a little bit before, I wonder about the potential of Sufism studies to contribute to that conversation, because I think there is a sort of dangerous trap that can potentially emerge in lifting up this particular form of Islam as inherently good. It is that, but it's not good in the way that former colonial powers and European and American right-wing politicians would ever be able to see. So what I think it can do is a sort of again, an opening for conversation, right? I mean, people say music is a language everybody understands. And so Sufi music, for example, the project that UNC had, that Karl Ernst was organized last academic year at UNC, bringing Sufi musicians, mostly Sufi musicians from all over the world to UNC to perform there, and having our students see that as part of their classes, attending these concerts and these performances, has done something that I was really skeptical about. I am very skeptical about the peaceful Sufi musicians will change the perception of Islam. I have to admit, against my own sort of intellectualized judgment, that it does work. So my students came out of these performances with completely different ideas about Muslims, which is sort of depressing when you think about it, because I've been trying to teach them that. But there's something that happens, and perhaps it helps to bring in the word emotion here, emotional. It's a connection that takes place on a different level. And maybe that brings us back to methodology, because one of the issues with academic methodology is our insistence that everything we do is rational and is on the rational plane, which is why it's expressed in language. And so I think it all sort of comes full circle in saying, are there other ways to study something that also engage emotionally in this way? And I think there were beautiful moments during the symposium where that naturally happened. And so maybe those are moments that are illustrations for what the potential there can be.